mercy on this land of mine. We all gonna get it in due time. I don't belong here, I don't belong there. I've even stopped believing in prayer.
Welcome back, everyone. What we're going to do right now is talk about the literary context of some of the African American readings. Now, it's not necessarily going to be the literary context of all the poems or the essay. It's going to focus on two particular movements because I think it's worth talking about those movements and what they were about. So the first movement is the Harlem Renaissance that comes with the notion of the New Negro. So you can see the anthology here, The New Negro, that was first edited by Alan Locke, who was a member of the Harlem Renaissance. So the idea of the New Negro is that now that slavery has been abolished and there is some time has passed, it is time to help African Americans grow intellectually and also grow in society, help develop a culture for African Americans. And the Harlem Renaissance played a major part in that the Harlem Renaissance was a group of artists and writers in Harlem who were striving to give African Americans a culture that they could call their own. The way they did that is taking aesthetic principles and ideas from white culture and incorporating African themes, incorporating African American themes as well, incorporating African American ways of speaking, but also just African heritage in general. So one way they did that is in the tradition of white poetry, for example. The African or the American tradition extends back to the British tradition, which in turn extends back to the Roman and Greek tradition. So you have a long history that you're playing with, and that is the history that is understood as poetic. What Harlem Renaissance poets tried to do to some degree was not essentially abandon all of that history, but incorporate African history. And they did that by referring to African locations, but to African legends and to African ways of being. The other thing they did is try to take African American ways of speaking and incorporate that into poetry. And finally, just dealing with themes that addressed African American people. So here's a brief timeline so you get an idea of where the Harlem Renaissance happens. So slavery has ended and segregation is firmly in place. Lynchings are starting to decline but have not disappeared completely. And executions are starting to rise. This period is also immediately after, or roughly after, World War I, in which, just like women in World War I, African Americans took on a larger public role, in part because they needed to. They were soldiers that were sent overseas, but they are also workers in more public and prominent roles in the United States. So the Harlem Renaissance is very small, partly because at the end of that period, many of the writers went off in their own directions, didn't abandon the project necessarily, but started to work less together. They sort of moved beyond the group that had existed in Harlem. And to give you an idea of where that comes in terms of some of the other things we've been reading, this gives you a broader idea of some other literature that is happening around this period. Not all of these things you have read, but a lot of them you have. So the other movement is directly related to Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka was born Leroy Jones, and in the mid-50s, he moved to Greenwich Village in New York. Now, Greenwich Village at the time was a hotspot for poets and artists associated with the Beat movement. So I'm not sure how many of you know about the Beat movement, but authors like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac were part of this movement. It was predominantly white. Some of them had Jewish heritage. But what they were notable for is celebrating activities that went against cultural norms. So that included sexuality and drug use and anti-capitalism. Those are all things that they celebrated, both through their poetry and their lifestyle. Leroy Jones became one of the very few African Americans involved in this movement. Some have even suggested that he was the token black guy of the Beat movement. He edited poetry for all of these writers and even produced some of his own. In 1958, he married Hetty Cohen, a woman of Jewish heritage, and they had 2 children together. Cohen was also a poet, but she was often overlooked, partly because she was a woman, but also partly because her poetry did not stand out in the way some of the other beat poets stand out. Leroy Jones's life started to change quite a bit in 1960 when he, along with a group of intellectuals, poets, and writers, went to visit Cuba. Now, they did this specifically to defy American intervention into Cuba. So by this time, the communist revolution had happened in Cuba, and there was a communist government in place. And the United States was very concerned about that and had launched an attack, and it also launched sanctions against Cuba. So a group of writers and intellectuals from the United States went down to show their support for Cuba and the revolutionary government. So that included people like Ginsberg, James Baldwin, and Truman Capote. Now, when Leroy Jones was down there, some of the Cuban artists and writers cornered him and said, "Why aren't you doing more for your people? What you're doing is essentially supporting racism and capitalism by not speaking out against it." And that had a very strong impact on Jones. His writing took a very political turn after that point, but he still remained in the beat movement and still remained in Greenwich Village. During this period, he also started to get dissatisfied with the civil rights movement and the advancement of civil rights. He was unhappy with the way, especially his fellow poets in the beat movement, decided not to speak out about race. So they had no problem talking about sexuality and drug use and anti-capitalism, but when it came to race, they did not speak out. And that frustrated Leroy Jones, who felt like that's a place they should speak out. The last straw for Leroy Jones was when Malcolm X was assassinated. Now, the story around Malcolm X being assassinated is that he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam. By that point, Malcolm X had left the Nation of Islam and was starting his own group, and that had angered a lot of people in the Nation of Islam. But what a lot of people point out is that the police protection that Malcolm X had mysteriously disappeared, and that is the moment when members of the Nation of Islam showed up, suggesting that police collaborated with the Nation of Islam to get Malcolm X assassinated. Jones saw that as the last straw. He saw that as the reason why he needed to make a change in his life. So after that event, Leroy Jones divorced his wife, moved out of Greenwich Village and into Harlem, that was a predominantly black neighborhood, and he became the founding member of the Black Arts Movement. And initially, what the Black Arts Movement did was establish centers that black artists, black writers, etc., and help them develop their art. But it was much more than that. It had an idea that black artists and black writers could use their art to fight against white supremacy and to establish a new black aesthetic that would counter the racial injustice that they had experienced, or at least partially counter it. Amiri Baraka, in particular, viewed poems as weapons he could use against racial injustice. And so in a poem he wrote not long after the one you are reading, called Black Art, he writes, "We want poems that kill, assassin poems, poems that shoot guns, poems that wrestle cops into alleys and take their weapons, leaving them dead." Leroy Jones changed his name to Amiri Baraka during this time as well, and he participated in numerous demonstrations. At one point, he was arrested when he was part of a demonstration and charged because he had 2 guns on him, 2 pistols that were unregistered. During the trial, they used his poetry against him to try and show that he was militant. Ultimately, the trial was thrown out of court and dismissed. The charges were dismissed, but he quipped afterwards to reporters that he was arrested for having 2 poems and 2 guns. Now, Amiri Baraka had a particular idea of what the Black Arts Movement was supposed to do, and he was very forceful with that idea. And so here he describes some of that in a 1966 essay called Home. The black artist's role in America is to aid in the destruction of America as he knows it. His role is to report and reflect so precisely the nature of the society and of himself in that society that other men will be moved by the exactness of his rendering, and, if they are black men, grow strong through this moving, having seen their own strength and weakness, and if they are white, tremble, curse, and go mad, because they will be drenched with the filth of their evil. So Mary Baraka is provocative and often stirs up controversy, and did until he died. But in this particular section, when he is talking about the aims of the black arts movement, his idea is that it's to create an alternate aesthetic, a black aesthetic to counter the white aesthetic that has racial injustice ingrained into it. And by being so precise, showing people exactly the black experience, black people and black audiences will feel empowered, and white audiences will be challenged by what they have done and feel nothing but guilt. So what you see specifically in the poem that you have to read by Mary Baraka is the beginning of this movement and the beginning of his change, where he leaves what was his home in Greenwich Village and moves to Harlem, and the kind of way that violence is incorporated into that move. And if there's any question about how he felt that should work and how he felt about white people during this move, this is the cover of the book in which both black art and the poem you are reading, a poem some people will have to understand, appeared in. You can see a white doll that is punctured by numerous needles. So I want to leave on this note by Larry Neal. Larry Neal is somebody who tried to write a manifesto for the black arts movement and was a close friend of Mary Baraka's. And he addresses violence in particular, and the way violence is portrayed and the way discussion of violence is portrayed, and how it is different in the white aesthetic or the white cultural ideas. He says, even though Western society has been traditionally violent in its relation to with the third world, it sanctimoniously deplores violence or self-assertion on the part of the enslaved. And the Western mind, with clever rationalizations, equates the violence of the oppressed with the violence of the oppressor. In other words, violence is fine when it is perpetrated by the army or the police, but not fine when it is perpetrated by people who are trying to stand up for their rights. All right, we'll leave it there for now. For next class, you need to post your questions and initial reactions to the African American readings. I'm going to post one discussion topic, for all of the readings, so that you can post all of your questions there, and I'll deal with them in the next lecture. We're also going to have close readings for each of those texts, and I'll be working with those and responding to them later week. That is all for now. Have a lovely day.
Oh, but this whole country is full of lies.